Beneath the relentless glare of a sun that offers no reprieve, the southern alluvial plains of Mesopotamia do not resemble a cradle of life. Instead, they present as a scorched expanse of salt-crusted silt and deceptive marshes, a landscape defined by extremes that should have, by all biological logic, remained a wasteland. The popular imagination often paints the Fertile Crescent as a lush, self-sustaining garden, but the archaeological record, revealed in the deep stratigraphic layers of Eridu and Uruk, tells a far more violent story. The earth here is not naturally generous. It is a hard, sun-baked crust that rejects the plow until it is forcibly broken. Driven by this environmental hostility, the early inhabitants were not settlers finding a home, but survivors negotiating a desperate truce with a geography that seemed determined to starve or drown them. The Tigris and the Euphrates, the two veins of this territory, were not the benevolent deities of the Nile Valley. They were erratic, volatile, and governed by the chaotic rhythms of distant mountain snowmelts. Consequently, the birth of civilization was not a leisurely transition into agriculture, but a frantic, coordinated defense against the very water that made life possible. The psychological state of the 4th millennium BCE was one of profound existential insecurity. To the early Sumerian, the universe was not a clockwork mechanism of order, but a theater of divine whimsy, where a single afternoon of storms could erase a decade of labor. This collective anxiety is etched into the earliest fragments of their mythology, where the gods do not love humanity, but merely tolerate it, often regretting the noise of human existence. In this atmosphere of dread, the individual was powerless. A single farmer could not hope to divert a river or hold back a flood that could rise 10 feet in a matter of hours. This harsh reality forced a fundamental shift in the human social contract. It was here that the concept of the collective was forged, not out of fraternal love, but out of the cold mathematical necessity of the levee. To survive the hostile gift of the rivers, every hand had to move in unison, every shovel had to strike the earth at the same command. Forensic evidence of this struggle remains visible in the calcified remains of ancient canal systems that crisscross the desert like the scars of an old surgery. These were not mere ditches, but massive engineering feats that required the movement of millions of tons of earth. A surveyor, perhaps standing on a ridge of dredged mud in 3400 BCE, would have looked out over a landscape where the natural horizon had been entirely replaced by human geometry. This unnamed man, clutching a knotted measuring rope and a sharpened reed, represents the pivot point of history. His task was not to grow food, but to manage the flow of energy. If his calculations for the canal's gradient were off by even a few inches, the water would stagnate, or worse, breach the banks and dissolve the mud brick foundations of the nearby village. His life was a constant battle against the silt that threatened to choke the arteries of the city, a relentless maintenance that allowed for no rest. Inevitably, the scale of these irrigation projects necessitated a level of organization that the world had never seen. You cannot build a 50-mile canal through the consensus of a dozen families. You need a hierarchy. You need a centralized authority to distribute the water, to hoard the surplus for the dry months, and to punish those who take more than their share. Driven by this logistical demand, the first bureaucracies emerged. The temple became the storehouse, and the priest became the administrator. The grain was not just food, it was a currency of survival, carefully measured and recorded by scribes using the first proto-cuneiform marks on damp clay. These records, found in the refuse heaps of ancient temple complexes, are the forensic anchors of this era. They do not speak of kings or conquests, but of rations of beer, baskets of wool, and the exact number of laborers assigned to the eastern dike. The fragility of this entire system cannot be overstated. History is often viewed as a steady climb, but in Mesopotamia, it was a precarious balancing act. Had the climate been slightly more stable or the rivers slightly less violent, the pressure to innovate may never have reached the critical mass required to build a city. If the annual floods had arrived in the autumn to water the seeds rather than in the spring to drown the harvest, the Sumerians might have remained a scattered people of small, independent villages. but the rivers were late and they were angry. This forced the development of the granary and the walled city, creating a fortress of human order against the chaos of the wild. The city was a machine designed to extract life from a landscape that offered only dust and flood. In the heat of the conflict mode, when the Euphrates breached its banks, the response was a chaotic, desperate race. Men, women, and children would have been pressed into service, hauling heavy reed baskets of earth to plug the gaps, while the water hissed at their feet. The sound would have been deafening: the roar of the river, the shouting of overseers, the rhythmic thud of wooden mallets against stakes. In these moments, the distinction between the individual and the state vanished. There was only the work. If the levee held, the city lived another season. If it failed, the salt would rise to the surface, poisoning the soil for generations, a catastrophe that frequently forced entire populations to abandon their homes and begin again in the unforgiving marshes. This cycle of destruction and reconstruction created an incredible resilience and technical sophistication. By the time the first true kings appeared, the infrastructure of the state was already centuries old. The palace was an afterthought to the canal. The power of the ruler was entirely derived from his ability to command the water. We see this in the titulary of the early lords, who called themselves canal diggers as often as they called themselves conquerors. They understood that their authority rested on the tip of a spade. The forensic reality of the soil, heavy with the salt of evaporated floodwaters, served as a constant reminder that the desert was always waiting to reclaim what had been stolen from it. The legacy of this desperate struggle is the very structure of the modern world. The decision to organize, to record, and to build for the collective rather than the individual was a response to the hostility of the two rivers. It created the first urban grid, the first legal codes, and the first systematic taxation. Today, when we look at the skyline of a modern metropolis or the complex bureaucracy of a global corporation, we are seeing the distant, evolved descendants of a Sumerian irrigation committee. The bargain struck 5,000 years ago to trade individual freedom for collective security against a volatile environment remains the foundational contract of human civilization. The hostile gift of the Tigris and Euphrates was not the water itself, but the crushing necessity of the labor it demanded, a burden that forced humanity to grow
where the
or
Tigris and
perish.
Euphrates
In the
rivers
end,
bled
it
into
was
a
the
chaotic
desert's
delta
refusal
of
to
marshes
provide
and
that
reed
made
beds.
us who we are.
It was an environment that offered nothing for free, yet promised an unimaginable bounty to those capable of imposing order upon its hydraulic volatility. Driven by the relentless accumulation of agricultural surplus made possible by the mastery of irrigation, the small egalitarian hamlets of the Ubaid period began to undergo a profound structural calcification. This was not a sudden revolution, but a slow, sedimentary process where the necessity of maintaining complex canal systems demanded a centralized authority. Inevitably, the communal labor required to dredge the channels and reinforce the levees transformed the social fabric from a collection of kin-based groups into a stratified hierarchy. The transition was fueled by the dawning realization among the inhabitants. The river was a god that could be bargained with through engineering, but the bargain required a spokesperson. As the marshes were drained and the fields expanded, the psychological state of the inhabitants shifted from a reactive struggle for survival to a proactive obsession with management. The spirit of the times was defined by a new claustrophobic intimacy with the concept of the future. For the first time, humanity was not merely living season to season, but was planning in decades. This collective mindset manifested in the rise of the temple, specifically the Anana district of Uruk, which functioned less as a place of quiet contemplation and more as the central processing unit of a vast biological machine. The temple was the storehouse, the bank, and the laboratory of the state. Consequently, the priests who managed these resources were not merely spiritual intercessors, but the world's first technocrats. They oversaw the distribution of the beveled-rimmed bowl, a ubiquitous piece of archaeological evidence found in the thousands across the Near East. These mass-produced, crudely made vessels served as the standard units of measurement for grain rations, grounding the abstract power of the state in the forensic reality of a worker's daily meal. The complexity of this growing urban organism soon outpaced the cognitive limits of the human brain. In the bustling courtyards of Uruk, where thousands of sheep were sheared and tons of barley were moved, the fallibility of memory became a systemic risk. To solve this, the administrators developed a system of clay tokens, small spheres, cones, and discs representing specific commodities encased in clay envelopes known as boule. This forensic trail of accounting reveals a society deeply concerned with the prevention of theft and the precision of the ledger. Imagine a single scribe, perhaps a man named Kushum, whose name appears on some of the earliest recorded tablets. He sat in the shadow of a mud brick wall, pressing a sharpened reed into damp clay to record 18 measures of barley. Kushum was not a poet, nor was he a king. He was a functionary in a system that had become too large for any one person to visualize. His work was the cold pragmatism of the state, a desperate attempt to freeze time and quantity on a portable surface. This administrative pressure necessitated the birth of cuneiform, a technology that began as a series of pictograms before evolving into a sophisticated script. It is a profound irony of history that the first words ever written were not a hymn to the gods or a declaration of love, but a receipt for beer. Writing was the ultimate tool of insulation, a way for the city to protect itself against the chaos of the natural world by turning physical reality into manageable data. Had the early inhabitants of Uruk failed to solve the problem of information storage, the city-state would have collapsed under its own weight, reverting to the scattered, vulnerable villages of the past. The fragility of this moment cannot be overstated. A single decade of catastrophic flooding or a series of administrative failures could have extinguished the spark of urbanization before it truly took hold. History is often perceived as a series of grand gestures, but the survival of Uruk rested on the mundane accuracy of its accountants and the durability of its mud bricks. The city of Uruk eventually grew to house as many as 50,000 people, an unprecedented concentration of humanity that required a rigid social stratification. Society was no longer a flat plane of shared experience, but a vertical ziggurat of specialized labor. There were the weavers, the potters, the metalworkers, and the soldiers, each a cog in a machine designed to convert the raw energy of the sun and the silt into the permanence of stone. This internal structure created a sense of inevitability, a feeling that the urban way of life was the only rational response to a hostile world. The individual was increasingly defined not by their lineage, but by their role within the bureaucracy. This was the birth of the citizen, a person whose identity was tied to the walls of the city and the records of the temple. The psychological toll of this transition was immense. The freedom of the nomad was traded for the security of the granary, and the unpredictability of nature was replaced by the predictable demands of the state. The architecture of order was not merely built of brick and mortar, but of grain and ink. The legacy of this period is not found in the crumbling ruins of the desert, but in the very structure of our modern existence. The sexagesimal system developed by the Sumerian scribes to track their goods still dictates the 60 seconds in our minute and the 360 degrees in our circle. When we look at a spreadsheet or a city grid, we are looking at the refined descendants of the clay tablets and irrigation ditches of Uruk. The tension between the need for centralized management and the desire for individual agency remains the primary conflict of the human story. The city was the first true insulation against the wild, a structured machine that allowed humanity to step out of the natural order and into the artificial order of the state. It was a choice made in the mud of Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago, a decision to trade the chaos of the river for the cold, enduring logic of the ledger, and it is a choice we continue to live with every day in the shadows of our own glass and steel ziggurats.
Each time we record a transaction or define a border, we are echoing the silent, deliberate work of those first scribes who realized that to survive, humanity had to become as organized as the stars. We are the inheritors of their administrative dream,
was
a
not an
world
absence
defined
of sound,
by the
but a
permanence of the
temporary
record.
suspension of consequence. For centuries, the early city-states had expanded into a vacuum, their mud-brick silhouettes rising from the marshes like the jagged teeth of a new world. The success of the irrigation revolution had been too complete. Surplus grain invited a surplus of humanity, and by the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, the horizon was no longer an invitation, but a limit. The landscape had become crowded, and the invisible threads of kinship that once bound the valley began to fray under the sheer weight of proximity. Driven by this demographic saturation, the city-states of Sumer found themselves locked in a geographical stalemate, where the prosperity of one could only be purchased with the deprivation of another. Inevitably, the shared reliance on the erratic pulses of the Tigris and Euphrates transformed the rivers from divine veins of life into disputed arteries of power. The friction of sovereignty began at the water's edge, where the act of digging a new canal became a declaration of intent and eventually a casus belli. The Sumerian spirit of this era was defined by a profound and unsettling realization. The gods were no longer the only masters of fate. While the early priesthoods had mediated between the heavens and the earth, they were increasingly ill-equipped to mediate between the competing demands of the irrigation networks. The collective psychological state shifted from one of communal survival against the elements to a paranoid vigilance against the neighbor. This was a world where a man's identity was tethered to the city wall, and the space beyond that wall was increasingly viewed as a theater of potential betrayal. Consequently, the internal structure of the city began to harden. The temple, once the heart of the community, found its moral authority insufficient when the fields of Umma began to drain the reservoirs of Lagash. The priesthood could offer prayers for rain, but they could not repel a raiding party intent on seizing the fertile Gedena, the edge of the plain. The times demanded a different kind of leader, one who did not just interpret the divine will, but who could enforce a mortal one through the application of organized violence. Evidence of this tectonic shift in human governance is etched into the very clay of the era. On a fragmented limestone slab known today as the stele of the vultures, we find the forensic record of the first great geopolitical struggle. It depicts Eannatum, the ruler of Lagash, not as a humble servant of the gods, but as a towering figure of military might, leading a phalanx of armored men over the prostrate bodies of his enemies. The detail is chillingly specific. The soldiers are depicted in a disciplined line, their spears leveled, their bodies protected by heavy felt cloaks and copper-studded shields. This was not the chaotic skirmishing of tribal hunters, but the birth of professional warfare. The stele serves as a testament to the fact that by 2450 BCE, the survival of the state had become synonymous with its capacity for destruction. The cost of sovereignty was now measured in the weight of copper and the precision of a spear thrust. Behind these grand monuments were the faceless individuals who bore the physical burden of this new reality. Consider a young man named Enlil-Ka, a third-generation farmer in the outskirts of Lagash, who had spent his youth clearing silt from the canals that fed his family's barley plots. In the year of the Great Drought, his life was abruptly reconfigured not by the weather, but by a decree from the palace. He was handed a heavy spear and a conical helmet of beaten copper. His hands, once calloused by the wooden plow, now blistered by the rough grip of a weapon. He stood in the suffocating heat of the Gedena, watching the dust clouds rise from the direction of Umma, realizing that the water he needed to keep his children alive was the same water the men on the horizon were prepared to die for. His individual fear was a microscopic reflection of the macroscopic instability of the entire Sumerian system. The rise of the Lugal, or big man, was the response to this systemic instability.
As the threat of conflict became a permanent feature of the landscape, the temporary military command of the elite evolved into a permanent kingship. The seat of power migrated from the ziggurat to the palace, a transition driven by the necessity of a standing army and the specialized labor required to maintain defensive fortifications. The city-state was no longer just a religious collective, it was a fortress. The architecture of the era reflects this hardening, as the once open settlements were encased in massive walls of sun-dried brick, some stretching for miles. These walls were not merely physical barriers, they were psychological markers that defined the us against the them, solidifying the concept of the border in the human consciousness. The landscape was being carved into a political chessboard, where every move was a zero-sum game. The fragility of this period is best illustrated by the Treaty of Mesalim, an early attempt at international diplomacy that nearly averted centuries of bloodshed. Had the boundary stone placed by King Mesalim of Kish been respected by the subsequent generations of Umma, the catastrophic wars that exhausted the region might never have reached such a fever pitch. A few inches of carved stone, standing in the desert wind, represented the slim margin between a cooperative hegemony and a cycle of vengeance. But when a later ruler of Umma chose to uproot that stone and cast it into the canal, he did not just break a treaty, he shattered the illusion of a shared Sumerian peace. That single act of defiance triggered a chain reaction of retaliatory strikes that would eventually leave the plains littered with the bones of thousands, proving that in a world of finite resources, the ego of a king is often the most volatile element. This era of constant friction necessitated a revolution in logistics and technology. The development of the four-wheeled battle wagon, drawn by onagers, introduced a new speed to the battlefield, while the standardization of weapon production signaled the beginning of the military-industrial complex. The city-state model, for all its cultural brilliance, was inherently unstable because it lacked a mechanism for peaceful expansion. Each city was an island of order in a sea of competition, and as their spheres of influence overlapped, the resulting sparks ignited a fire that would consume the independent spirit of Sumer. The transition of power was absolute. The priest who spoke to the gods was replaced by the king who spoke with the sword, and the administrative state was born from the need to feed, arm, and move men to the front lines of a perpetual war. Subtle echoes of this ancient friction resonate in the modern world, where the same rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, remain the subjects of intense geopolitical negotiation and conflict. The lines drawn in the silt 5,000 years ago, the first tentative boundaries of the first sovereign states, established the concept of the frontier that continues to define our global map. We live in the shadow of the Lugals, inhabiting a world where the defense of a border is still considered the highest expression of national purpose. The mud-stained records of the Lagash War remind us that the struggle for resources is not a failure of civilization, but its founding condition. The legacy of Sumer is not just the wheel or the script, but the enduring realization that sovereignty is a wall that must be constantly maintained, and that the price of the city is the shadow of the sword, a heavy debt we still pay each day
The
across
sun
our
over the
global
Mesopotamian
borders.
alluvium in the 24th century BCE did not shine upon a nation, but upon a fractured landscape of competing divine households. For a millennium, the history of the Tigris and Euphrates had been a repetitive, exhausting cycle of city-state rivalry, where the walls of Uruk, and Lagash served as both sanctuary and prison. The collective psychological state of the era was one of profound localism. A man's identity was tethered strictly to the shadow of his city's ziggurat and the specific deity who supposedly inhabited its heights. There was no concept of Mesopotamia as a political whole, only a series of zero-sum contests over irrigation rights and border stones. This fragmented existence was underpinned by a religious fatalism that viewed the world as a chaotic assembly of divine whims, where one city's rise necessitated another's ruin.
Driven by this perpetual insecurity, the Sumerian kings exhausted their populations in fruitless sieges, creating a power vacuum born of mutual depletion. It was into this atmosphere of stagnant warfare that a figure emerged from the northern shadows of Kish, a man whose very name, Sharukin, or Sargon, meaning the true king, suggested a desperate need to justify a radical usurpation of the old order. Sargon did not descend from a line of established monarchs. He was a creature of the court, a cupbearer to the king of Kish, who recognized that the traditional structures of power were brittle. The forensic evidence of his rise is found not just in later epic poetry, but in the sudden, violent shift in the archaeological record of the mid-3rd millennium. Inscriptions on clay cones and stone stelae begin to reflect a new language, Akkadian, a Semitic tongue that began to push against the ancient Sumerian prestige. Sargon's genius lay in his rejection of the city-state's inherent limits. While previous conquerors, like Lugal-Zaggisi, had sought to dominate their neighbors, they remained culturally bound to the idea of the city-state as the ultimate unit of human organization. Sargon looked beyond the horizon of the palm groves and envisioned a unified political entity that transcended tribal and urban boundaries. Consequently, he moved to dismantle the physical and psychological barriers of the past. When he marched against Uruk, he did not merely seek tribute, he sought the destruction of the city's autonomy. The conflict was chaotic and decisive. Akkadian composite bows outranged the heavy Sumerian phalanxes. Bronze met leather and wood. The walls of Uruk, once thought impregnable, were leveled, and the king Lugal-Zaggisi was led in a neckstalk to the gate of the god Enlil in Nippur. This act was not mere cruelty, it was a calibrated ritual of desacralization, proving that the old gods of the city-states were subservient to a new, centralized authority. Inevitably, this military success demanded a revolutionary approach to governance to prevent the new empire from dissolving back into its constituent parts. Sargon understood that a state held together only by the spear is a state in constant revolt. To solve this, he established the city of Agade, a capital that belonged to no ancient god and no single tribe, serving as a neutral hub for a burgeoning bureaucracy. He implemented a system where 5,400 men ate bread daily before him, a detail captured in contemporary administrative tablets that points to the creation of the world's first professional standing army and civil service. This elite class owed their loyalty not to a local district, but to the person of the emperor. The administrative genius of the Akkadians manifested in the standardization of the tools of civilization. Before Sargon, every city-state utilized its own idiosyncratic systems of weights and measures, making long-distance trade a logistical nightmare of constant recalibration. By decree, the Akkadian gur became the standard unit of volume, and the shekel was fixed in weight across the empire. These were not merely economic tweaks, they were the ligaments of a new imperial body. A merchant in the cedar forests of Lebanon could contract with a temple official in southern Sumer using a common language of value. The shift in Mesopotamian identity was profound and unsettling. For the common laborer, the change was felt in the sudden expansion of the known world. Consider a nameless brickmaker in the city of Nippur, a man whose ancestors had never traveled more than a day's walk from their home. Under the Akkadian peace, he might find himself pressed into a labor gang sent to the distant silver mines of the Taurus Mountains or the timber forests of the Amanus. For the first time, the four quarters of the world were not just a mythological concept, but a reachable reality. This individual would see his local grain tax being diverted to a central storehouse in a city he would never visit, managed by a governor who spoke a different primary tongue. This was the birth of the imperial model, the extraction of local wealth to fund a central vision. The fragility of this new order, however, was always present. Had the Elamites to the east or the Gutian tribes to the north coordinated their raids in the early years of Sargon's consolidation, the Akkadian experiment would likely have been a historical footnote. The empire survived its infancy through a mixture of ruthless military patrolling and a clever religious synthesis, as Sargon installed his daughter Enheduanna as the high priestess of the moon god Nana in Ur. By merging Akkadian and Sumerian theology, he gave the empire a spiritual backbone. As the empire matured, the reach of Agade extended towards the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, creating a scale of cultural exchange previously impossible. The standardization of the cuneiform script allowed for a unified legal framework, ensuring that the king's justice and his taxes could reach the furthest outpost. This was the era where the concept of the subject replaced the citizen of the city. The psychological burden of the empire was the loss of local agency, but the reward was a period of unprecedented stability and wealth. The archaeological strata of this period reveal a surge in exotic materials: lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from the Indus Valley, all flowing toward the heart of Akkad. This was not the result of random trade, but of a state-sponsored maritime and overland network. The empire had created a protected space where commerce could outpace conflict. Yet the very success of this centralization created its own vulnerabilities. The reliance on a single charismatic lineage meant that the health of the state was inextricably linked to the competence of the ruler. When the rains eventually failed and the climate shifted toward aridity, the centralized system, for all its brilliance, lacked the flexibility of the old smaller units to adapt to local catastrophe. The legacy of Sargon's unification remains the fundamental template for human political organization. The transition from a collection of warring neighbors to a centralized state was not a natural evolution, but a deliberate, violent, and intellectual rupture with the past. The Akkadian Empire established that a single law, a single currency, and a single administrative language could govern a diverse and sprawling population. This paradigm shift was so powerful that even after Agade fell and its location was lost to the desert sands, every subsequent conqueror in the region, from the Babylonians to the Persians, sought to claim the title of King of the Four Quarters. The modern world, defined by its nation-states and global standards of measurement and law, is the distant but direct descendant of that first imperial vision. The boundary lines and administrative districts, first scratched into clay tablets by Sargon's scribes 4,000 years ago, established the geometric logic of the state that continues to define the borders of our maps today. The reach of the First Empire was not merely across the geography of the ancient Near East, but across the very timeline of human history
that were once
itself.
the pulsing heart of the human world. These mounds are the only physical witnesses left of a civilization that did not just exist, but invented the concept of the future. While the mud-brick temples of Uruk and Babylon eventually yielded to the desert winds, the architecture they housed proved far more resilient than stone. This was not a world of progress, but one of desperate necessity. Driven by the unpredictable flooding of the Twin Rivers, the early Sumerians were forced into a collective psychological shift. They moved from the ephemeral life of the wanderer to the rigid, calculated existence of the urban dweller.
In this era, the city was not merely a settlement, but a machine for survival. The spirit of the times was defined by an anxiety regarding the divine, a belief that the only way to appease gods and manage humanity was through meticulous order. This order required a medium that could outlast a human voice, and thus the damp clay became the first hard drive of history. The transition from memory to record was the first great revolution of the mind. Consequently, the stylus became mightier than the sword long before the phrase was conceived. In the year 1754 BCE, a scribe in Babylon labored over a massive block of black basalt, carving the 282 laws of Hammurabi. This was not merely a list of prohibitions, but a declaration that the state had a duty to the citizen. Consider a merchant, Enlil Nadine Shumi, standing before this stone in the mid-afternoon heat. For the first time in history, this man did not have to rely on the whims of a local chieftain or the mercy of a priest. He could look upon the cuneiform and know exactly what the penalty for a broken contract would be. This established the concept of legal accountability, the idea that justice was a fixed external reality rather than a subjective gift from the powerful. Had Hammurabi chosen to keep his decrees oral, or had the Elamites destroyed the stela during their later raids, the concept of a codified public law might have been delayed by a millennium, altering the trajectory of Western governance and the definition of civil rights. Inevitably, the management of these burgeoning cities demanded a precision that the human eye could not provide. The Mesopotamians looked to the heavens not just for omens, but for a rhythm they could replicate on Earth. They developed the sexagesimal system, a mathematical framework based on the number 60, which offered a versatility that decimals lacked. This choice was not arbitrary. 60 is the smallest number divisible by the first 6 numbers, making it the tool for a society obsessed with the division of rations, land, and time. Because the Sumerians mapped the stars with such accuracy, they created a chronological prison in which we still reside. Every modern watch echoes the pulse of a priest astronomer standing atop a ziggurat 4,000 years ago. The Greeks, awed by this computational power, adopted it. When Ptolemy mapped the cosmos, he used Babylonian degrees. This transmission of knowledge was a chain that linked the Tigris to the marble halls of Alexandria, and eventually to the digital screens of the modern world. The endurance of these ideas is a paradox of fragility and strength. We possess the records of Mesopotamia largely because of catastrophe. When the great libraries of the Assyrian kings were put to the torch by invading Medes, the heat of the fires did not destroy the books, it fired the clay tablets into permanent ceramic. This irony, that the destruction of a city ensured the survival of its memory, is the reason we can still read the laments of a forgotten poet or the tax receipts of a grain merchant. There is a specific forensic reality in a tablet found in the ruins of Nineveh, the fingerprint of a scribe pressed into the edge of the clay while it sat in the sun to dry. That individual is long gone, their civilization a ghost, yet that fingerprint remains a bridge across 4,000 years. It serves as a reminder that history is not a series of abstract movements, but the accumulated labor of individuals who were terrified of being forgotten. Had those fires burned less fiercely, the entire history of the Near East would be a silent void. The psychological legacy of Mesopotamia is the city itself as the primary unit of human existence. They were the first to grapple with the friction of living in close quarters, the noise, the sanitation, the crime, and the weight of bureaucracy. They invented the concept of the suburb, the marketplace, and the professional class. Driven by the need to feed thousands of people who did not farm, they created the first complex economies. This was a world that was, for the first time, in love with the idea of its own permanence. They built high, not just for defense, but to scream their existence at the sky. The ziggurat was a physical manifestation of the reach for the divine, a staircase between the mundane mud and the eternal stars, reaching upward towards the heavens. This urban blueprint became the standard for every civilization that followed, establishing the city as the crucible of human progress and the site of our greatest social experiments. Consequently, the fall of these empires was never a total erasure. When the Persians and later the Greeks moved through the region, they found a landscape already saturated with the way things are done. The administrative structures, the weight systems, and the way of measuring a year were so deeply embedded in the soil they could not be uprooted. The Romans, though distant, inherited the Mesopotamian obsession with the rule of law and the engineering of the urban environment. The invisible frameworks of our modern life, the 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle, the contract signed in ink that mimics the seal pressed in clay, are the true monuments of the Fertile Crescent. We do not live in the ruins of Mesopotamia. We live inside the logic they perfected. The endurance of the written word ensured that while the walls of Babylon fell, its mind conquered the world. The legacy is absolute. In every courtroom, every laboratory, and every ticking clock, the ghost of Mesopotamia continues to dictate the terms of our existence, proving that the word is more durable than the empire.